And so it gets a little crazy, right?
Hmm.
I actually think it's fixable, right? I actually really believe this can be fixed.
Fortunately, Sam has been brought back as OpenAI's CEO, but the underlying problem remains.
This shows the fragility of any startup or any early stage system. Clearly, those tensions must have been there early on and they just kind of ignored it. And I think if you don't get the initial conditions right, when you have a chaotic environment like this, you're going to be doomed to failure. So we have a fascinating perspective into OpenAI here at OpenEXO, not just because both of the names start with the same few letters, but more importantly, we have been thinking and analyzing exponential organizations for 10 years now, and there's absolutely no question that OpenAI is an exponential organization. I think the problems that we're seeing with it, despite the unbelievable progress and the record growth, $90 billion market cap achieved in about a year or so, unprecedented in today's world, is there's a misalignment of MTP. So, for example, back when they started OpenAI, the MTP was really to deliver AGI into the world in a safe way. And it was a nonprofit structure. Reid Hoffman, Elon Musk funded it, and others funded it to get going with that mission statement, with that massive transformative purpose of how do you deliver that. As they went along, it got converted and they created a for-profit subsidiary with the nonprofit board overseeing the for-profit subsidiary. Now, the for-profit OpenAI subsidiary has created the most unbelievable market valuation, market access, thousands and thousands, 10,000 companies leveraging their API. The problem is the MTPs are not compatible because either your MTP is to go and massively deliver value and create value, economic value, leveraging AI, or it's to study, research, and safely deliver AGI into the world. And the board had one obligation to follow the original mandate and has the exposure legally if they don't follow that. Meanwhile, the commercial success has meant there's a different MTP. And so I think that's the fundamental difference is the separation of church and state on how to deliver AGI into the world and a difference in how to do that. Research and kind of cautious analysis of AGI on one hand versus commercial scalable success on the other.
So, Salim, what do you think the impact on overall AI progress would be if this isn't solved?
I think this sets back progress by multiple years because many companies are leveraging that API and building products and services and have been for several months now. Now, when you suddenly break the trust around that, this becomes really critical. And now people have to find another source or redo their products or services without it. So 10,000 companies are now scrambling to figure out what they do. Now, this brings us to an important EXO attribute, which is interfaces, right? When you have an interface, you're typically leveraging an API from somebody else to build on top of, and that entails risk. Both Kent and I have built businesses that leveraged other people's APIs and suffered from it. I built one called Angstro, which eventually got sold to Google, but we were waiting for LinkedIn for 18 months to get their API ready. They kept promising us it was ready. And when it finally arrived, it was so diluted that it wasn't that useful. And it pretty much killed the business because 18 months in a startup lifecycle is almost forever. If you're going to depend on somebody's API, you better make sure they're absolutely rock solid about delivering that API. For example, if you build something on the Amazon shopping API or the Amazon Marketplace API, pretty rock solid that Amazon's going to be around for a while. When you see a vagaries of a startup, no matter how exciting it is, like an OpenAI, you want to be super careful about putting and betting the bank on that API. So, Ken, you've studied the OpenAI org structure a little bit, and as far as I could see from the diagram, there are 7 different entities and stakeholders involved. And I'm wondering if you could speak to and just talk through what you've seen in that structure, because this is one of the more complicated structures we've ever seen for governance.
Yeah, so what these folks were trying to do was build a structure that would allow them to pursue AGI and kind of have a handle on things if I think by chance they actually discovered it, but it has turned on them in a way. And the basic structure you can see in the diagram here. And in this diagram, there are three key entities. The first key entity is what they call OpenAI Inc. And that nonprofit is managed by a board of originally, I believe, 5 people, 2 of the co-founders and 3 independent board members. Then underneath that, what you see is the holding company for OpenAI. That's basically the same as OpenAI Global LLC. The OpenAI Global LLC is kind of the operating concern, and this is where all of the IP sits, which is really important. And it's also what they call the capped profit company. And we need to come back to that in a second, because I think the big part of the problem is in this. And off to the right, there is something called the OpenAI GP LLC. This actually sounds a lot like an investment partnership, right? An LP fund. So you have a GP and effectively you have an LP. And in this case, the LPs are all of the employees and the LP owns the IP, the intellectual property. And so it gets a little crazy, right? And then you ask yourself, well, how are they handling stock? LLCs don't issue traditional equity. Then the big thing that comes in from the left is Microsoft. And when they came into OpenAI, they brought $1 billion. Then they came in and they brought another $10 billion. So I think the fundamental breakdown in what is intended to be a really innovative governance structure is that it could not withstand the amount of money really that flowed into it. And that comes back to the capped profit structure. It says they have a 100-to-1 profit to investment is the cap. So this means if you just don't even think about all the other people that invested, their cap profit is 1.1 trillion. So what does that mean? It means that the board is not obligated to send any profits to the nonprofit if net profits are under $1.1 trillion. When is the 501c3 going to get money from the LLC? Basically never, except by the good graces of the board. Now that's the same board that just fired the CEO and Greg, right, the other co-founder. They have this concept of innovation in organizational structure. It looks fairly complicated. So that's kind of an overview, Salim, of what's going on. Now, again, I think they were trying to be really innovative. I think they tried to do the right thing. Look at these actions. Think about what they were trying to do. They want to be a research organization searching for AGI, but their product got so successful and so much money flowed in that now everything's exploding in a bad way.
I mean, the only major winner I see out of this is Microsoft. And the big losers are the 10,000 companies that are trying to build products and services off an API, which is totally indeterminate what happens now.
So one of the interesting things, Salim, that we both have a lot of experience implementing EXOs at scale. If you take a look at all of this through a lens of EXO and you think about the attributes themselves, what could they have done differently? How those attributes could have been applied? What do you think? Like, could they have done leveraged assets? Could they have done looked at the global LLC as staff on demand and given that staff on demand a representative board seat?
I think they did a very good job in leveraging staff on demand or community, or the crowd is another way to put it, because the crowd came in and said, we want to use this and we'll pay for using this. They found product market fit very, very early and very quickly. I think maybe one big flaw was you really want to build community alongside crowd. If you think about, say, TED didn't go straight to the crowd. They gave away the TEDx talks to interest the crowd, and then they used community to scale TEDx events. And those two in concert worked incredibly well. So I think something that people miss is you have to scale community and crowd at the same time. I'll give you another example in a different realm, which is Uber, which uses staff on demand and reaches out to the crowd and says, hey, who wants to be a driver? But because they don't have a community, there's no loyalty to the MTP. And pretty much every Uber driver also drives for Lyft. Something that if you don't create community, you don't create the emotional stickiness to the MTP around that, which is what I think one thing they could have done. They could still do it, but I see that's probably the biggest flaw in the mapping of OpenAI to OpenEXO and how we think about the attributes in the model. You know, this shows the fragility of any startup or any early stage system. And I think if you don't get the initial conditions right, when you have a chaotic environment like this, you're going to be doomed to failure. I think the big lesson I take from this is no matter how much is involved, make sure you have your MTP and everybody's aligned on that MTP before you start going out. Clearly, those tensions must have been there early on and they just kind of ignored it. And then, as you say, the amount of money involved has corrupted the whole thing, blew it all up.
I actually think it's fixable, right? I actually really believe this can be fixed with a restructuring of the board. I don't think the board needs to resign. I'll be clear about that. They have operational experience that's valuable, but I would like to see them augment the board, as we talked about earlier, so that it's just more fair, right?
Yeah.
It needs to be fair toward the mission. Let's not forget, the reason they created the commercial entity in the first place was to be able to provide money to the nonprofit. So there's clearly something wrong with the cap structure.